Well, unfortunately, some sad news also coming from the land of the Comets. On New Year's Eve, one of the legendary Comets owner slash business manager, Colin Lister, passed away at the age of 83. And really, I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame. He really kept the team afloat.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Tell us what you know about Colin.
Well, I always like to say that there were four cornerstones of the Comets in the 50s. There was Ken Elliott, there was Bob Chase, there was Bud Gallmeyer, and there was Colin Lister. And all four of them were huge impacts upon the franchise because the franchise was dying when Lister and Elliott came here in 58, 59. I mean, they were so far in debt, there was no, they just had nowhere else to turn, and so they went and they were able to convince Ken Elliott to come in, and he was just the master at becoming the first hockey guy to run the franchise. And he really helped turn things around. He brought in Lister. But you take away any one of those four cornerstones, and if you do it just three, without Bob or without Colin or without Ken or without Bud, I think the franchise fails. I really do. The finances were just so tough back then. And Colin is the guy who kept them alive in the 80s after Ken retired in 82. Colin lost tons of money, but he kept them going. And it was just his spirit and the players trusted him. I mean, here's a guy, your checks are bouncing. And, if you're a player, you can imagine, or just a worker, imagine your checks are bouncing and how you're going to react to that. And he always made good, and they always trusted him. I mean, there could have been a dozen times over those years where the players said, if we're not getting paid, what are we doing here? We're not making that much anyway. The crowds weren't there at that point, but Colin always made it good, and he always kept it going. And really, he was kind of the bridge until the Frankies could take over in the 90s, because it was Colin's teams that they fell in love with. But Colin, you just have no idea how much he impacted all these just hundreds and hundreds of baseball players and hockey players in this community. And I'm not just talking about it in sports either. I mean, in faith, in education. I mean, the guy was in like 75 or 80 weddings that he stood up in. And he was like the best man in, I want to say, 35 of them. And, wow. Often he'd end up paying for big parts of those weddings, too. I mean, it was just amazing all the things that he did for his kids. He just was an incredible example on and off, away from the rink. And it just, he was the off-ice face of the franchise for 30 years. I mean, you think about the Comets have been around for 59. Well, they wouldn't have been around for 10 without him.
Yeah, owned the Comets business manager for 26 years, sold the team back in 1985. Still a big part of the team, for years after that. Yeah. And then you mentioned about baseball. They had the Connie Mack League renamed after him. Blake had a great article in today's News Sentinel. If you didn't know Colin Lister, read up on the article.
Or if you want to read more, read Legends of the Comets. I mean, there's a really that was one of my favorite parts of the book to write, because one, Colin was already ill, so I didn't get that much chance to talk to him about it. But everybody else I got to talk to, it was just fascinating to hear all these stories about Colin and what he had meant to their lives. I mean, it's just an amazing impact that he had on people, and it didn't have to be if they were related to hockey or baseball or whatever. I mean, he was just the ultimate people person.
Well put. I know calling is Tuesday down at the Lakeside D.O. McComb & Sons from 2 to 9, and then the funeral is at the First Assembly of God off Washington Center Road Wednesday at 11 with calling
and I would guess it's going to be a fairly lengthy funeral. I imagine there'll be quite a few people getting up to speak and relaying their memories of Colin, and which would have driven him crazy. But that's all right. I mean, there are a lot of people who owe him a lot and who just want to say thanks.
Any idea if the team plans on doing anything?
Yeah, the team's going to have a moment of silence before Friday's game. And you remember how they when Vi Elliott passed, they had a logo near on the dasher boards. They're looking into that for Colin as well, and that kind of thing.
Okay, well, good man.
Yeah.
And we'll have to see what they'll do on Friday for that, as when the Comets.
Yeah, that's a big night Friday when you think about that,
huge.
and you think about Colin Chalk coming back. I mean, that's a big thing. I mean, those are two big things. I mean, it's too bad that Colin was ill for so long, because I think today's generation of fans doesn't understand his input, his impact. But if he had been healthier, it would have been, he was every bit, would have had as much impact on the games as Ken Elliott does now going to the games, and that kind of thing. I mean, this really was a cornerstone. I mean, this was a cornerstone of the IHL, too, for years and years, where they kept it going. And he and Ken were the big part of that.
That's why he's the man with all the Comets knowledge. As always, he's Blake Sebring from the News Sentinel. I'm Ross Kinsey, and thanks for watching.